Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are in the Johnson edition, and we turn now to poem 565, One Anguish in a Crowd. Now it's very possible that the anguish that's being referenced here is the my period of the previous poem 564 that we just finished with. Now this is in many ways back to the consideration of anguish and pain and suffering that's so profound in so much of Emily's stuff. You will remember, I hope, 165. A wounded deer leaps highest. I've heard the hunter tell. 'Tis but the ecstasy of death, and then the break is still. The smitten rock that gushes, the trampled steel that springs, a cheek is always redder just when the hectic stings. Mirth is the mail of anguish, in which it cautious arm, lest anybody spy the blood, and you're hurt, exclaim. Or how about 167, 2 poems over? Do you remember this one? To learn the transport by the pain, as blind men learn the sun. To die of thirst, suspecting that brooks in meadows run. To stay the homesick feet upon a foreign shore, haunted by native lands, the wild and blue and beloved air. This is the sovereign anguish. This, the single woe. These are the patient laureates whose voices trained below ascend in ceaseless carol, inaudible indeed to us, the duller scholars of the mysterious bard. Now, our assumptions that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily is our playlist. Hopefully you've worked through our set of introductory comments as well as the preceding 564 poems. We just finished with 564. We referenced that my period had come. Now, in this poem, Emily will make another comparison. That is to say, oftentimes, small things, which she'll call units, will lead to big things, that is to say, what she calls legions. And there is a certain kind of comparative or relativeness to this poem that is going to, I think, lead us to some studies in sociology as well as psychology. She says it this way. One anguish in a crowd, a minor thing. It sounds, and yet unto this single doe attempted of the hounds, 'tis terror as consummate as legions of alarm did leap full flanked upon the host. 'Tis units make the swarm. A small leech on the vitals, the sliver in the lung, the bung out of an artery are scarce accounted harms, yet mighty by relation to that repealless thing, a being impotent to end when once it has begun. It is such a powerful recognition that so many of Emily's poems rest on a single word, and that word just turns everything, like the word impotent in this poem. Notice she'll begin with the idea of one anguish. Again, 31 poems she mentions the word anguish. Notice dash, in a crowd, dash. That is to say, an anguish in a bunch of other challenges. It's kind of a minor thing. In other words, small. Notice we go from minor to small leech. A minor thing. It sounds. In other words, that's kind of the way we would think of it. And yet, unto the single doe, again, back to the leaping deer, right, of 165, attempted by the hounds. 'Tis terror. She uses this word terror in 7 of her poems. You'll remember 281. 'Tis terror as consummate as legions of alarm did leap full flanked upon the host. In other words, you can see this word picture. One bark, one thing. Whole bunch of hounds coming after that poor deer. That's terror. She uses this word terror, right? And then she'll say it. 'Tis units make the swarm. In other words, big things become big things because little things build up, right? And we're all together familiar with the way this works, right? What is it that Claudius says in Hamlet, the play Hamlet? When sorrows come, they come not single spies, but in battalions. Very similar. In other words, it's one raindrop after another raindrop that leads to the flood, that obviously leads to the terror. Then she'll say it a second way, from minor to small. A small leech. You'll remember, guys, I said that in 77 of her poems, she emphasizes fragility and smallness. A small leech on the vitals. The sliver in the lung, the bung out, a leakage is her side note on this poem when it was originally written. The bung out of an artery, just a little bit of a leakage, are scarce accounted harms. When it all starts, when illnesses start, they often start out as nothing, right? I mean, a little sliver, for example, and yet mighty, she says, by relation. It's always about comparison, right? To that repealous thing. You'll remember repellus from 409, the only other time she uses this word. A being, dash, impotent to end. She uses impotent in 8 poems. When once it has begun. In other words, she says, arguing it to a messages here, that often minor things become major things as they begin to swarm or build up in life. And to be, again, as we said, it's always about, it seems, just one word. I mean, we could go through all of these poems that we've already read and more that we obviously will read and ask, what's the one word that so much of the poem hinges on? It's fun to read it that way. At 3a, of course, the connection to 165 and 167 is obvious, I think. At 3b, when was a time that isolated pain or anguish became something of a swarm of terror? And how did you deal with that? Thank you.